and and manages to redress a point which is I wouldn't want to say weak, but still relatively controversial in Whitehead, namely that the international dimension is not that important. You notice he in the essay, both at the beginning and toward the end, he says that it's kind of striking for somebody who has spent 35 pages on that international dimension, illustrating all its various facets and contradictions. By the way, showing the cyclical nature right through the international roles and its changes. But he nevertheless says what is important is not that. I think this is a little bit a function of having worked with comparativists, O'Donnell, Schmitter, at that time even still von Linz and others, who were always focused on the countries, and to the extent they went beyond the countries, how it's comparing countries, right? So as Louis showed us last time, in a very productive way, you can go single country, or you can go a couple of countries at a time, compare them. International dimension somehow means something else, and that dimension to Lawrence Whitehead, for example, has both legal and a political side, and he illustrates them in a very good way. Surprisingly, saying it doesn't. Neither matters too much. It's the domestic that determines the domestic level that determines the outcome. Even when you compare, as Louis did, what happens in Chile is not because of Argentina. What happens in Argentina not because of Chile, but you can take them together and see the phenomenon in relationship to one another, even if they did not form their politics in that way. Now, I already said, oh yeah, let me, no, I'm gonna return to it in a second. I did already say that Linz and Stepan represent a different view on this particular subject of the role of the international. In 1996, if I'm not mistaken, already in the introduction, and this wasn't planned by me, I just noticed it on rereading the book, they explicitly criticized Whitehead. I don't know if I'm going to find a page now, but he explicitly criticized Whitehead, saying that the international dimension, no, I know where it is. It's in the beginning of the discussion of Russia and the East. Should be in 235 and after that somewhere, where they explicitly say the international dimension is all important. And of course, they say this. This is on page 235 of the Linz and Stepan book. Lawrence Whitehead argued that the internal forces are of primary importance. Clearly, such a judgment would obviously unwarranted for East Central Europe. So the change of venue, the change of context leads to a kind of transformation, change of the judgment. I would say that if any of you who are careful readers of the Whitehead essay would agree with me that if we go back to even the period between the end of the Second World War and 1986, when the essay was written, the international dimension really did matter. A lot of evidence in the actual text which shows that international dimension, especially international political dimension. So we can begin with a relatively positive assessment of the importance of the topic. The international dimension is not just another side, but it is a constitutive side. Now, of course, the question is when. I already showed that what accounts for the difference in emphasis is time. 1986 is one time, and 1996 is another time. Well, of course, you could say 10 years always makes a difference, except in this particular case, between time A and time B, the Soviet Empire collapsed, new states were formed, conflicts emerged, starting with the Yugoslav internal war, going on to internal warfare in lots of ex-Soviet republics, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, in the controversy over Nagorno-Karabakh. There is also an internal war in Moldavia. Ukraine, well, we can bring it up to date because that is a conflict that is still flowing from that particular process. So the epoch, the time between our two texts is structured by a huge difference in the overall international political context. Why it matters, I'll try to explain it in just a second. But before then, let me say that and in this class, I wanted to do this an even wider historical frame later on, that the period after the Second World War ought to be understood in terms of epochs already. So the whole international factor, the international interactions among states, the kinds of interventions that occur in the world, of which there are many, obviously, are different in different epochs. For the sake of simplicity, let me say that the first epoch is the immediate post-Second World War. Immediate post-Second World War, when on the one side, lots of countries are waking up from the immediate past of fascism, right? And therefore the rejection of authoritarian politics, at least on an ideological level, is almost a common international heritage. And on the other side, the conflict with the Soviet Union, a conflict of the Western countries, Soviet Union, has not yet emerged. They were wartime allies. So the immediate post-war, lasting perhaps till 1948 or so, represents pretty unique epoch. From 48 on to, if you want, 1990, there is a generally accepted name for that epoch, the epoch of the Cold War. It's not always cold. I mean, I see looking at you, right? Because at least in one place, I'm looking at you too, because there are a couple of, I don't mean to typecast my students in my classes, but at least two places I can discover real war right away. And there are probably many more than that India-Pakistan war too, which is not immediately part of the Cold War setting, and yet in the end turns out to fit into it. But the Korean War would be the most dramatic military confrontation in this period. So the Cold War is not always cold, and it is a long epoch because some after effects of it last into the very late 1980s. So that's sort of the most general picture. Under the influence of my son, who stresses more the economic domain, I would say that even this period of the Cold War can be divided into two epochs: the period of social reform. 30 glorious years, sometimes it's referred to by authors, the welfare epoch of the welfare state, and then the epoch of neoliberalism, which we associate with the presidency of Reagan and the prime ministership of Thatcher, but actually plays a role in almost all countries. These epochs affect the problem, but affect the problem in ways that interact. You can see this, of course, through the Whitehead, the Whitehead essay in particular, because for him, the conflict with the Soviet Union, conflict of the Western countries with the Soviet Union, is a formative element of political change, also in a variety of international settings. So to take the example that is earliest in my mind, and I was in Hungary still at the time, the overthrow of President Arbenz in Guatemala was part of the Cold War.
Yeah.
The reason he is overthrown is because of his supposed unreal, because it was imagined, but supposed openness to interaction with the Soviet Union and Soviet politics. The thing is not always resolved that way, because of course you can think of the Cuban Revolution, where things go in a different direction. But certainly the Cuban Revolution then affects the attitude of the United States in all the Latin American countries, and in some sense the shift from initial acceptance of democratization to the acceptance of dictatorships is very much linked to that Cold War phenomena. My son, in this context, introduced the economic dimension, which is worth also mentioning, because one could interpret the struggle over communist influence and anti-communism as one dimension, but an equally important one is the fear of economic actors of to some extent not the model of communism, but the model which is emerging from lots of European countries, namely the model of a social welfare state. There's a problem of property involved, and that's pretty much my son's stress. And in this sense, the cycle could be explained in relationship to the problem of economic interests and the fear of property owners of not necessarily a Cuban type transformation, but even a democratic socialist transformation. After all, there is no sign at all that Chile was developing in the direction of a Cuban type dictatorship. But that version of the left too could be interpreted as a threat. If this were the case, by the way, I asked him, and we didn't work out a really good answer, is why you have democracies at all. Because the securest protection for foreign owners from nationalization, from various forms of intervention, would be a model like Pinochet's. I mean, and not only is it neoliberal, but it is also it also reverses earlier attempts at expropriation and reprivatizes, which is in line with the interests of not just former owners, but also new investors and new agents who wish to invest their surplus property. Why do you have democratization at all? In the post-Second World War period, I think I already to some extent explained it, namely that the rejection of dictatorship, Mussolini's and Hitler's, has an effect elsewhere too. At least international actors find it difficult to deal with those whose form of rule is an inheritance from the fascist past. Spain is the most interesting case from this point of view, because though we have good reason to accuse the United States and even some of the European countries of too much tolerance of the dictatorship in Spain, there is a brief moment after 1945 where Spain becomes a pariah, not admitted into the United Nations. There seemed to be a desire to push democratization through political means from the outside. But as it happens, the Cold War logic takes over, and dictatorships, as long as they're anti-communist, as Whitehead shows, become allies in that effort. Sometimes, as in Greece, this matter is literally fought out, and if you wanted to, I don't know if this is your own view of it, see Greek politics as a kind of cycle between pretty restricted forms of democracy and dictatorship, and it is almost always somehow connected to, at one point, a real communist insurgency, and later on with the Papandreous, it becomes the fear of an overly reformist, socially interventionist political model. After, in the Cold War period, that model is for a while dominant and produces results, combining, if you want, economic interest in preserving property and political interest in fighting communism, even fighting political tendencies that are suspected of being overly friendly to communism. Now, this picture needs to be complicated. And two ways of complicating it is distinguishing between law and politics. Whatever one can say about the validity and the strength of international law, the legal development is in the direction of a kind of democracy preference. Yeah. I just got a book by Tom Ginsburg called Democracies and International Law. I haven't read it, it just came today. Yeah. I'll bring it into this class and the next one at some point. And I think it is, this is well shown in Whitehead, that there is a development in legal structures in the direction of preference for democracy. That's kind of peculiar. I just looked at a couple of lines of the Ginsburg book, and he rightly starts out with the idea that classical international law is skeptical or agnostic is the right word, agnostic with respect to democracy and dictatorship, because classical international law is based on the interaction of sovereign entities, and non-interference ought to be the rule. So even if you prefer, if one country, a powerful country, or a group of countries prefer one political model, it is not their right by the traditional international law to interfere in the political system of another. If internally it becomes a dictatorship, let it be. If internally it becomes a democracy, that too should be accepted. Of course, that's the formal law, and the practice never fully corresponds. But the law itself changes. The law itself changes. And it changes not because of abstract international law, but the emergence of international organizations. They can be international or regional, but they are based on treaties in which countries surrender a part of their sovereignty. And one part they surrender in theory, again, not necessarily in practice, is the right to order your political structure any which way you want. So if you follow Whitehead's analysis of the law, you will see that the United Nations has a requirement of at least constitutional states of some kind as to being members. I mentioned already, Spain is excluded. It is excluded initially on that basis. The UN is going to soon violate that principle. Spain will be let in under American pressure, and a democracy requirement does not really survive. But it develops at another level, a level of regional organization. The Council of Europe perhaps is the first one, which has a kind of constitutional democracy requirement for membership. The EU doesn't have it initially, but it is added to it through later agreements and adjustments to the treaty. The OAS has a democracy requirement. If I'm not mistaken, the Organization of African Unity has such a requirement as well. Again, you laugh because there's so many dictatorships that emerge in the context of that supposed requirement. How is it enforced and how it is not? But it to some extent, of course, matters, and political actors themselves refer to it. So from a variety of declarations to treaties to regional agreements of various kinds, a kind of bias for constitutional democracy emerges, even the cycle that we're discussing, or perhaps contradicted by the cycle that we're discussing. So if that's what the law says, why is the practice so different? I think in order to talk about this, one really asks whose practice. Whitehead is a Brit, and I think one of his biggest interests in the essay you read is to compare US and European practice. So international law, that is common, and in that sense, the difference between the two settings should not be emphasized. And indeed, if one brings in the Soviet bloc, it too has participated in the international legal structures, which, or at least some of them, which have a democracy requirement. But of course, when it comes to politics, the internal politics of these blocs, not just two, but three, really matter. Whitehead does not emphasize the Soviet part of it, the Soviet bloc part of it, but I think that Soviet bloc is part of the reason, part of the arrangement of competition, the context of competition, in which the differences between Europe and America emerge. What is the biggest interest of the United States? Well, of course, ideologically anti-communism in this period, but there is also the security interest. For the Western countries, the United States becomes the major dimension of providing for military political security for the rest. This role can play this function can play a role even in part of the Soviet world. If you think about how is it that Yugoslavia remains independent, with some consequences for its internal political ordering too, becomes more decentralized, less dictatorial as it develops. The reason that this is possible because the United States at some point extended its umbrella also to Yugoslavia. The reverse also applies. How does Cuba survive? How does Cuba survive in the context of unrelenting American pressure? Yes, Khrushchev had to remove the rockets, but the threat of world war over Cuba remained on the horizon, and the United States would not go if it got some of its goals, namely the removal of the rockets. It kind of had to concede. This is not a treaty, but some kind of tacit agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev that the U.S. will not itself invade Cuba, which was unclear before that very near conflict. So in a way, protection of the existing lines of the division of the world, and to some extent, along with that, the political arrangement, since obviously the Soviet Union protects dictatorship in Cuba, and the United States cannot say protects only constitutional democracy, but protects systems which adhere to the interests of the United States. Again, with my son stressing the fundamental property interest. So if this is the case, why the difference between Europe and America? Right? Well, first of all, because the security interest is overwhelming interest for the United States and less for the Europeans who get the American umbrella. So they can worry about other things. But I think the more significant aspect of this is internal development. The United States remains, in spite of the New Deal, which started another direction of development, the United States remains in a world of still highly individualistic and corporate-oriented capitalism. The corporations remain important in Europe too, but the development is in a different direction. So the U.S. version of capitalism comes under threat in settings which involve a radical social reform, whereas the European version does not come under threat in such a setting. Yeah.
I feel like the experience of
Experience Poland.
is also attributed toward life and very historical.
It's a nice point you're making. Now, I think we have to be relatively careful, right, in thinking about the West as one thing and the Soviet bloc as one thing also. So in the case of the West, I was just on the verge of making the point that you have differentiation between European welfare states, which have a very different international policy in terms of dealing with dictatorships elsewhere, and the United States, which, as long as property is endangered or property is secure, will take different attitude to dictatorship. So a significant difference, and I think you could go further, because even in Europe, there's a distinction between the United Kingdom that often comes close to the same position as the United States and other European countries, which are much more interested in their model, the social welfare model. And the point that you're making is that one should not deal with the Soviet bloc as one thing either. Now, of course, the most fundamental problem of the Soviet bloc after the Chinese Revolution is the Soviet Union and China. You can't even call it the Soviet bloc. I don't think you would refer to it as Soviet bloc, although in 1948-49, the survival of the Chinese Revolution was dependent on Soviet help. But with the development of a very different Chinese model, and perhaps even more importantly, the development of a Soviet model away from the Stalinist model earlier, the divergences between China and Soviet Union become the greatest. When I speak about Soviet bloc, that's an exaggeration already, because for a lot of the periods, China is an independent actor, participates in the Bandung Conference, at times supports non-aligned countries, At times, it intervenes on its own. For example, the Chinese-Vietnamese War was a quasi-war between the Soviet client and China. So one has to recognize that the three-part division of the world, Europe, United States, Soviet bloc, has to be pretty quickly abandoned as a period develops. But within the narrow Soviet bloc, where there is military dominance, there is also a divergence. And I think that there are two significant ones. You mentioned Poland, but I think Hungary should be mentioned too, because in the Polish case, the dimension of politics remains in a way less Sovietized, and the influence of the Catholic Church, for example, remains great in the whole period. In the Hungarian case, first from death of Stalin, and then again in the 1960s, it becomes experimentation with a different economic model, and that influences Poland too. Now, for our topic, I didn't emphasize this because, as against China, you can't speak about a full Polish or Hungarian foreign policy, which influences things in a different way than the Soviet Union's own policy would. They remain in their foreign face or in their foreign presence really satellites of the Soviet Union. China, in this respect, is radically different, and there is certainly a clear difference in Chinese foreign policy, which is not always going to diverge. In the case of Cuba, for example, China doesn't deviate from the initial posture of the Soviet Union, but in other cases it does. And I think it's in particular in relationship to the states that do not clearly belong to any of the blocs. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that in the development of democracy, the European and the American roles are significantly different. This is the point of Whitehead, right? Namely, the definition of democracy. The U.S. definition is individualistic. The European one allows for some elements of collectivism, social rights, welfare state provision. This is going to matter, above all, of course, given geography, going to matter for Portugal, Spain, and Greece, right? Because Europeans, do they count for Latin America much? I mean, the Latin American students here, yeah, I mean, Europe matters, but certainly no one would say that the cycle of dictatorship and democracy in Latin America is involved, has much to do with European policy. The Europeans may not like certain things. For example, the overthrow of Allende was not popular in Europe, not even with European governments, but they can't do a damn thing about it. But they could play a very active role, for example, in Spain. I mean, the German Social Democratic Party was totally active in Portugal too. And that's interesting because in a way it converged with American anti-communism, who the Europeans support is not the radical socialists of these settings, but they do support socialists. So González in Spain, Soares in Portugal, I guess Papandreou would be the only example. There's ambivalence with respect to Greece, because Papandreou was more radical in some respects than these people, but still they are acceptable from the European point of view. And that means that, for example, their overthrow, in the case of Papandreou, clearly, is something which is resisted by European countries, much less so than the United States. So model of democracy matters, geography matters, and then organizations matter. I think a nice part of the Whitehead essay is that he suggests that civil society matters in this case too. In other words, formally private organizations, NGOs, clubs matter. It doesn't really illustrate it very clearly where such a body or such a intervention has made a clear difference, but he does illustrate this for political parties, in particular the Socialist International. The Socialist International, which not only has, of course, European members, German Social Democrats, French Socialists, and the rest, but it also has Latin American members, sister parties. I think that to some extent the overthrow of Allende, I'm sure it would be interesting to look at the documents from '73 of the Socialist International, harsh condemnation of the Chilean coup, because sister parties are involved. If you want, a model which could have been more radical than any European Social Democrat, but it was still recognizable. And so in this respect, the international dimension, international political dimension matters, but it matters where the country whose future is at stake is located. Didn't even talk about Africa or Asia. In the case of Africa, decolonization becomes a really important dimension of exactly international interventions, and not just interesting, and not just Africa, because even in the Caribbean, decolonization is an important factor, and in that case, the ex-colonial powers' role matters. Now, is the United States more important for a Caribbean country than its former colonial power? That depends on the context, and certainly there are places like Haiti, where the former colonial power is looked at only negatively. The French who take material retribution from Haiti after it has become independence. France is never a friend to Haitian democracy, but the United States is not either, which is why Haitian democracy has been in such trouble. Other places in the Caribbean would allow for perhaps more European influence, and that would balance the American role. In any case, these influences play a significant role, irrespective of the international legal provisions, which would prejudice the outcome in a linear way, if you want, toward democracy. The history is not linear. Of course, it's titled Cycles, and I think the cycles matter. I think that my son's theory here has a better chance of being right than mine, because I test the political dimension. But why would that be cycles? I mean, after all, if the political dimension, the challenge of the Soviet Union, really matters in the period of the high Cold War, that power becomes less and less important as the period develops, and I think one needs to explain how come the cycle continues in a period when the communist threat has become relatively insignificant. I think in all your countries there has been a communist party, but how important it is at certain stages, I think, can be fairly questioned. Of course, individual contexts matter, because to an important extent, Peronism plays the role of the social reformist movement in Argentina, and Communist Party probably is a lesser actor. But in Chile, for reasons that probably are historical and have to do with the development of Chilean political system, Communist Party really did matter and played a significant role, and unfortunately tragic role in terms of its fate in the development that we're discussing. I think that, and I said I give him credit because he made such a strong pitch for this view. The economic dimension has to be brought in if we're going to continue to speak about the cycle. And that economic dimension has to do, even in the European cases, with a fundamental switch. The switch from social orientation to neoliberalism. Because with the neoliberal turn, the kind of interest which primarily is represented by the United States in the earlier period, up to the mid 1970s or late 1970s, becomes generally represented. And this, of course, means that in such a context, it's not only the communists who represent a fundamental threat, but classical Peronism, which had redistributive aspects, right? And socialism in the Chilean sense too become fundamental threats. So dividing the period in the way that I have in terms of the Cold War first, which gives you the major axis of political antagonism, to then social reformism period within the period, and then the second period within the period of neoliberalism, help explain how the cycles are possible. Now, it is in this context that I switch from Whitehead to Linz and Stepan, who now take us to 1996. And of course, you all know in terms of periodization that whether you think or not that neoliberalism is still the dominant international ideology today, in 1996, there was no question about that. That's the high point, right, where they have written their book. And the really significant thing that happens, of course, before then, namely the collapse of the Soviet Union, happens in this period, right? The Soviet Union did not collapse during the first phase of that Cold War epoch, right? Almost did, well, at least almost did. I think it's an absurd thing to say. But if you're Hungarian, you would be tempted to say, well, we got close. 1956, not only Hungary, but Poland too, in 1956, as a very strong reformist project. If the Hungarian thing succeeded, then the Polish one certainly would have gone in the same direction. Political pluralism added to economic decentralization and reform. Anyhow, at that particular moment, the empire did not collapse. I always laugh when I see these movies, The Empire Strikes Again, because if you're a Hungarian, that's exactly what you experienced in 1956 November. There was an independent revolutionary movement. It was left-leaning. There were worker councils all over the place. This was not a capitalist restoration project, although there were people around who were dreaming perhaps of that. And then the empire struck and ended it. And in the period of the high Cold War, that's how it went. But by the time this empire collapses in 1989 to 91, we're in the neoliberal period. And so to the extent that in 1956 in Hungary, lesser extent Poland, a kind of social democracy with workers' councils is the project, by 1989, 1990, it does become restoration of capitalism. And, I know the Hungarian economics profession, almost without exception, economists promoted that, namely a radical shift to a capitalist market economy. Now, this takes different form in different countries. You were right in raising that question. With respect to Poland, it takes certainly a different form in Poland. We can talk about it a little bit in discussion if you want. I think the reason why Poland being so different at that moment is because between 1981 and 1989, the most powerful force in Poland is the labor union, the Solidarity Union. And so in that sense, in Poland, was an open question what type of social model will follow. In Hungary, there is no such movement, and the rest of East Europe also not. So the countries move in different directions. But I think by 1991, well, I would say by 1990, formulas like shock therapy, like radical privatization, like non-interventionism of the state into the economy, this became dominant throughout the region, as we'll see in just a second. Even Russia too. But in the Central European countries, this moment was also linked to political projects of one kind and another. And so there is a simultaneous development of political change and of economic radicalism, or if you want, neoliberal radical. I did not assign the piece by Klaus Offe to you, but I now put it on the reading list. Capitalism by Democratic Design. We published it in Social Research here first. The piece actually was strongly influenced by Jon Elster's piece. I don't remember the title of it, where Elster shows that the simultaneous establishment of democracy and capitalism will be very difficult, because capitalism will produce inequality, will produce shocks, will produce new forms of problem, and that means that the relevant populations will use the democratic voice to interfere with the economic process, and vice versa. Economic interests will try to interfere with the democratization process, because democracy will be a certain kind of threat. That was Elster's original piece. It influenced everybody. I debated with it at the time, and I thought that Klaus Offe's version was really more interesting, and in terms of the future, more relevant, because Offe talked about the difficulties of a triple transition. One, to a constitutional democracy in the political level, two, to a market economy on the economic level, and three, a viable state on the level of the geopolitical structure. And he tried to show in the essay, like Elster, that at least two of these represent competing logics. Marketization and democracy represent competing logic. Of course, you say, what else is new? Karl Marx already knew that. And of course, this literature, to some extent, of course, still influenced by Marxism. Often doesn't make clear how the problem of the nation, or the problem of state formation, is also going to be a difficulty. The third transition will represent problems also for the rest. Why didn't Offe stress this? He's a good friend of mine, but I'm going to say something. He was German. And because for that one place, the eastern part of Germany, this was not going to be an insoluble problem, namely stateness, state formation. I think to some extent makes him a little bit myopic. To his credit, he introduces the problem, unlike Elster, the state problem, but he doesn't make much of it, because after all, he says in one place in the essay, which is relevant to exactly what we're talking about, that the difficulties of the double or triple transition can be mediated with international help. I mean, after all, the problem I mentioned before, simultaneous marketization and democratization won't represent too big a problem if somebody else will economically support the process, because the capitalist economy will be dynamic eventually. So all you need is time to actually save time, and time can be saved by external help. Offe says it's not going to be forthcoming, and he even says Even in Germany, it's difficult, but in fact, in Germany, it happened. If you actually study the collapse of the German Democratic Republic and the formation of the new Germany, you will see that there's a very significant amount of social economic transfer of funds because the East German firms had to be liquidated. The old socialist type economy is not going to be working. So that means people will be temporarily under grave hardship. They probably had difficult time, but that difficult time was to some extent mediated by this external support, which became, in the end, an internal support. Only Germany has the experience of the international dimension becoming domestic. Do you see what I mean? Right? I would always ask, where is Western Hungary that is going to sustain the economic transformation? That will be a difficult one. Well, there's no Western Hungary. Yeah, Hungary can be divided into, on the map, to Western, Eastern, Northern, Southern. Every country can. But in the German case, there is a state, an extremely wealthy one at the top of it, perhaps the most wealthy one in Europe. Other countries, Poland and the rest, don't have. And so in that sense, the problem of the double transition is difficult to resolve through international support. But why is it a triple transition? Well, if you talk about Poland or Hungary, and you don't do it with radical nationalists, the chances are that people will agree that the geographical territorial boundaries of the country are set. That is true in most Western European countries. Spain is a bit of an exception because Spain also has territories where the ethnic and linguistic composition is different than the majority of the country. Catalonia is one and Basque Country is the other. So Spain has an internal, most European countries, France might have had this 100 years before, Normandy and Brittany and Alsace were pretty distinct in terms of the older French history. But by the end of the Second World War, there's no Occitanian problem or no Brittany problem. Basque too, there's a Basque country in France too. There are some issues, some conflicts, but not really serious ones. So most of Western Europe does not have these kinds of issues, and Eastern Europe, to some extent, was freed from it by the period of Soviet domination. But what about the imperial center? So I think the reason why the international dimension it becomes so much more important for Linz and Stepan than it was for Lawrence Whitehead is because the context has radically changed. I can't do much on this because I can already see that I'm running out of time, but maybe just 5 minutes on this particular subject. And it refers to the Linz and Stepan, 10 minutes maximum. Linz and Stepan start out with mentioning the Elster II transitions as being a problem. And even in a footnote, Offe is mentioned as 3 transitions, but Linz and Stepan mentioned that 5. The 5 arenas in which, for a consolidated democracy, you must make fundamental changes. Well, we already have the constitutional structure, the political structure. We already have the dimension of the economy. So what else is added? Civil society, the Polish model, becomes a third terrain, and then they add the rule of law, as well. In the end, they come up with 5. It's not so important for us now to enumerate them, but the problem of the state becomes one of the 5 in this context, because a modern state, in order to have an efficient relationship with the economy and to other social problems, needs to develop Max Weber 101, a a stable, rational, predictable administration, bureaucracy. You know, when we were Marxists, I don't know if you can say that about yourself, bureaucracy was always a big enemy. When we become even slightly Bavarian, we no longer see it that way, right? The question is that bureaucracy, of course, can be a horrible threat if it takes over all of social life, colonization, as Habermas calls it. But bureaucracy is a necessary part of running a modern society, whether just or unjust. And in that sense, the Central European countries are different than Spain and Portugal and Greece during their transitions, because in these countries, administration has been totally transformed according to the communist nomenclatura system. The bureaucracies are political and do not develop rational structures. And above all, to take two of the areas and let's step on together, they are not dominated and they are not restrained by the rule of law. The most important, again, Max Weber 101, the most important precondition of a modern bureaucracy is a modern legal system, where things are predictable, where the bureaucrat can make decisions, but only under existing rules. That's not how the communist bureaucracy works. And the communist countries, that is the kind of state that is inherited. With the collapse of communism, that state is dramatically decomposed, and what is going to be put in their place. But this problem of a state also raises another related question. I took my first 5 minutes, I'm going to do the other 5 minutes. The nation, right? Because modern states, we imagine many of them to be nation states. And, some really are, like Korea. You will probably tell me that there are differences, significant ethnic differences within a country like Korea. Japan, for example, people very often think of Japan as a genuine classical nation state. But, one closer studies a country like that, one will discover significant differences and even tensions. And of course, for a place like China, those are really inevitable because it is such a large and complex territory. So the nation state may be a myth or may never strictly exist, but it can be realized to larger or lesser extents. And the point is that before the Latin American transitions, before the South European ones, what its territory was pretty well established. I mean, I don't know, maybe some Peruvians think about, changing borders at the expense of Chile, and some Chileans might imagine that changing borders at the expense of Peru might be, they fought wars over this, but I think in the 19th century, right? Early 20th, you're correct. But in any case, this is gone. And even if you think about Central America, it has this strict territorial limits. I don't think that, Guatemala, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, I didn't want to say Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, boundaries are up for grabs anymore. Dominican Republic and Haiti, even in that case, the borders are set. So in the case of the transitions up to 86, explaining the Whitehead approach, did not have to raise this problem, right? And you had your transition Latin American countries, you dealt with Chile and Argentina. You didn't raise the question, and Brazil could be thrown in. The issue of what is the territorial structure of the state is not a question. This was different for the Soviet Union. And you can throw in a little bit, if you actually are more careful than I just was, you can throw in Germany and Czechoslovakia too. Because in those two cases, what state unit the liberated country will belong to was to some extent an open question. But when it comes to what's often called the inner empire, we talk about the Soviet Union as an empire. It has an outer empire. Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, to some extent, are in the outer empire. There's an inner empire. And with the collapse of the Soviet system, the inner empire collapses. Which is first, which is second is an interesting question. But I think with Gorbachev, it is the system as a whole which is put into doubt. And it is toward the end of Gorbachev's presidency that independent projects in the republics emerge, and the response to that during the crisis of the very early 1990s is in fact separation and the creation of 15 units. 15 states emerge in the place of the ex-Soviet Union. But what's the problem? Well, it's a double problem. It's a double problem, depending on whether you look at it from point of view of the peripheral 14 or the central one, namely Russia. From the point of view of the peripheral states, they got big Russian populations. Today, the language would call them settler colonialism. I don't like that term so much because in some contexts, it indicates that people who have lived someplace for 3 generations still don't belong. So settler colonialism it's used all the time, of course, and I understand it. Of course, the United States as a whole is a settler colonialist country, after all, because the white populations are not indigenous, and nor is even the African American part of the population. But in any case, if we use that term at all, in lots of these 14 countries, there is a huge Russian population of settlers who have been there for 2 or 3 generations. And that represents, from the point of view of the formation of a congruous nation state, a problem. And you can see that in the Baltic in particular, first, where they have passed laws which deprive Russian speakers of citizenship. But you even see it in the Ukraine, where the law is not as rigid as that, but where Russian speakers conceivably or arguably found themselves in a weak position. So in the republics, it's a question of what to do with the settlers. It's a very weird term or very weird problem, because in Latvia and Estonia, the Russian part of the population is almost a majority. But anyhow, it was a problem from the point of view of the formation of states owned by what it was called in Soviet Union, their titular nations. So what's the problem of Russia? It's not that there are huge Lithuanian, Georgian, Uzbek populations in Russia proper. There are, of course, some of them. The problem for Russia always is that some of our people are abroad. So the problem of 14 out of the 15 is that it's very difficult to become a nation state, given the fact that we have so many Russians in all of them. And the problem from the point of view of Russia is if you can create a nation state here, we have responsibility for the people abroad, the Russians who are abroad. And many of the conflicts of the period, which we are now experiencing, one of which we are experiencing still, is coming from this kind of conflict. Because from the Ukrainian point of view, those who are Russian speakers here should become Ukrainian and should be Ukrainianized. And from the Russian point of view, the problem is that so many of our nationals are oppressed and forced into a national definition which is not theirs. So in the external empire, it's a double transition. David Noffa and Lance Elster, that is the fundamental problem. economy and democracy. In the inner empire, the problem becomes the other two transitions, namely state making and democracy promotion. And the national conflicts make political democracy extremely difficult, whether in the core or in the periphery. Okay. I didn't go any longer tonight, promise. Please. Yeah, please.
Do we have to think of the race and ethnicity respectively about with regard to the authoritarian transition to democracy? Because we need to take into account the nation building, and so in some geography, the ethnicity problems are in ascendance, but when it comes to another parts like the Latin American countries,
Well, here, the problem is that the imaginary, which seems to play such a big role in modernity, is that of a nation state. Even the United States, which Lindsay and Stepan try to call a state nation, that's their own little terminology for it. Even the United States, for a long time, after the Civil War, because before the Civil War this was not possible, but after the Civil War, the project seemed to be that of building a nation state like all the others. I think to some extent white supremacy is a kind of residue from that.
Yeah.
You know, the idea, if you really come down to it, that only whites are true American. This is really the white supremacist idea. So African Americans, well, it's a misfortune that they're here, they will say, could have been, you know, repatriated to Africa. Some of the white supremacists even say Jews shall not replace us because even they don't count. So you have to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. You know, when I came to the United States, and none of you experienced the United States that way, there was a term called WASP, W-A-S-P.
Yeah.
And an immigrant like me knew that the true American is a WASP. Even Catholics don't really fit. And the Irish always had a problem here. So the idea of making a nation state even was alive here. Now think about much smaller spaces, which have much more centralized political forms. American federalism makes it so difficult to imagine the United States a nation state, because all the 50 states, originally 13, now 50, right, have some different ethnographic, ethnic makeups, religious makeups, to make that into one, e pluribus unum, right? That's you can see on your dollar bill, out of many one. It's impossible in such a setting. But if you think about France, where the idea was always that of a centralized, bureaucratically administered unit, the idea of making everybody into French in the French sense, namely the Parisian sense, ultimately, was not only viable but to an important extent successful. A famous book was called "Peasants into Frenchmen," and one of the chapters, I don't remember the author's name now. One of the chapters deal with the fact that France has Britons and Normans and Germans and Basques and Jews and blacks and of course people from Asia, from the colonial possessions of France, Vietnamese. So of course France is heterogeneous in some sense, and yet you know the school system, the cultural interactions and all the rest have homogenized to some extent. So between, I don't want to, say which country in my mind is ethnically the most homogeneous, because I always turn out to be wrong. But let's just stay with France and the United States. There's a big gulf between the two. But the United States is not the outer limit of possibility. There are states which are more federal or more confederal than the United States. So there are political options, and Linz and Stepan, with their concept of state nation, try to promote exactly that. India for them is a state nation. Today with Modi, I think they would have some serious doubts. They even say if Hindu nationalism triumphs in India, its state-nation quality could collapse. State-nation being that in India there are Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims and many tribal groups. It's heterogeneous, and yet they manage to live together because different states of India are organized according to different ethnic rules, and of course religious rules, and of course by different party systems. So there are other options, but this power of the nationalist, it's a nationalist idea, right? It's a classical nationalist idea that a state should belong to a nation, and a nation not only belongs to a state, but it needs to become homogeneous in order to be the proper cultural symbolic dimension of the state. This idea is still very strong. Linz and Stepan call this nationalizing policy. They have a list of them at some point. Nationalizing policies are policies that promote a single language. And they actually talk about Ukraine a little bit, is that in the late Soviet period, the Ukrainian Republic, which is to some extent already becoming more autonomous, is imposing a Ukrainian linguistic rule. This happens in the Baltic everywhere. I don't know to what extent it is true today at this late date, but in a place where you have almost half Russian speakers, suddenly the only acceptable linguistic form of communication, whether in the schools or the press or in social institutions of various kinds, is Latvian or Estonian, becomes a kind of rule. And so one nationalizing policy is that. Another nationalizing policy, of course, has to do with the schools, which teach the history, and which, in the context of, let us say, Latvia and Estonia, or Ukraine, perhaps now also, present the history as a history of struggle against Russian oppression. So education, language, history, of course, access to political life, ban against ethnically based parties, which of course is always against the parties of the minorities. These are what Linz and Stepan call nationalizing policies. And these play a role in lots of places. Now you'll tell me, and I think this is what we discussed with Alexandra today, is that I think the idea that it's only relevant to the Soviet sphere, because in France and Spain, perhaps, and Portugal, it is no longer the biggest problem, does not apply to at least parts of Latin America, because indigeneity in Latin America turns out to be a foundation for significant difference. And of course, Brazil obviously has, besides indigeneity, has also the problem of the heritage of the very large African population. So you could say that really this stateless problem and the state-nation problem is not just Central European. It is not really there in the O'Donnell, Schmitter volumes, but by the time Linz and Stepan developed their notion of stateness being one of the presuppositions for democratic development, they have to pay attention to it. I think if you revisit the problem, you will see many more stateless problems in Latin America too. So in this sense, the question, I interpret your question as saying, what do you do about it once you have it? I can't comment on efforts which are contemporary, but for example, the idea of plurinationalism was one notion that emerged in Bolivia. And to some extent, the Chilean constitution makers attempted to adopt it for the reconstruction of the Chilean state. Actually, one of the conflicts was over that. But in this sense, the idea that there's only two transitions for, but there's only one transition for Southern Europe in this theory. There's a double transition for Central Europe. There's a triple transition for the inner empire of the Soviet Union. These concepts could be applied to other settings also. And then the question is, how do you solve them when older problems come up? Yeah. Yes. Loud so I can hear you.
Yeah. I'm just wondering about the case of South Korea. Korea is of course over the empire, but we separate like north side and south side. It's a different state. But I guess that Korea is one of the most homogeneous, really homogeneous nation state, and when it comes to imagining the unification of Korea, can it be the triple transition applied to this, or?
That's what I would say. I would say it's going to be triple, but let's talk about it. Why? Obviously, Germany was unified, right? So the economic system of East Germany is replaced by basically that of the West. The political system is integrated into the Western political system. So a double transition, the triple, as far as I know, no one wanted an independent East German state because of our different history. There might have been people, I think I'm wrong, at the round table, because we didn't talk about these transitions in detail. At the round table of East Germany, there were people who thought that we really need a pretty long period of independent existence and transform ourselves according to our own way. And that view lost because on the streets, people were yelling, "Wir sind ein Volk." First, "Wir sind das Volk," that's a very nice turn. We are the people. Yeah. That's a democratic slogan. The party is not the people. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. And at some point, they began to shout, "Wir sind ein Volk." We are one people. So in that sense, the stateness problem was solved on the emotional level by much of the East German population. Yeah. Would this happen the same way in Korea? I'm not sure, because the developments have produced such different systems and such different forms of life that if you're a North Korean, you're not. But if you're a North Korean person, the question would arise, if we were actually transiting or going to a much better political economic system, would we want to become one with them? It's not an ethnic difference, right? No ethnic difference. So it's not the ethnic problem, but it's the problem of having had such a different history for so long.
Yeah, it's about like over 60 years. But I'm also wondering that we are actually the democratic regime, but they are not. The North is not. And if kind of be like unified, then they should be transformed their regime from authoritarian to democratic. And then from South Korea point of view, is can we call it kind of a democratic transition? Because we already accomplished.
No. I mean, it's the same problem as for Germany, right?
Yes.
I mean, West Germany is now different, of course, but that's because history forces a lot of changes. For example, that you have such a strong green movement is new in Germany, West Germany, so it doesn't remain the same. But nevertheless, in terms of its overall political structure, Bundestag, the political parties, the structure of parliamentary government, basically the economy, the same enterprises remain You know, Volkswagen does not disappear as a private corporation, or BMW. You know, I mean, these are the things you know best from the world market and so on. So in a way, West Germany changed because its state actually has become a much larger one, in a way more powerful ultimately, not immediately because there was a lot of burden involved. But the change occurs if you're a citizen of East Germany, if you're from Dresden or East Berlin, then of course radical changes, economic and political. So that's, you know, there's not too many countries that have been divided in this way. I suspect that there's only two, right?
Yeah.
In this period of the Cold War and so on. So in that sense, you're facing something that they faced as well. But I think there are some reasons for thinking that in spite of all this unification, the parts don't become just the same. One sign of it, for example, that the extreme right is much stronger in the ex-East German provinces than in the Western ones. So the political outcomes in the East are quite different even now. And this is now, it's 33 years later.
Yeah.
And yet there are significant political differences. So the idea that we become one is not clear, you know, not obvious. You do become one in many ways, but not in every possible way.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, what you face. And I think you face this because the differences between South and North Korea are even more radical than between East and West Germany, because of the way the political system works. I mean, Linz and Stepan, I don't want to now be too nasty here, but Linz and Stepan would call the North Korean version of communism sultanism.
Yes.
They would call it sultanist because when the rule is so personalized in one figure, in one ruling structure, where even generation, right? That doesn't even happen in China. I don't know if Mao Zedong had children, but his children don't get a status once Mao is dead. But in Korea, it's the son, right?
Yeah.
And there's a daughter too, right?
Yes.
So there, it becomes a kind of dynastic. History changes things. And I remember, this is going to be funny for you, but I was a child during the Korean War, and Comrade Kim Il-sung was a good friend of Hungarian teenagers or Hungarian children. This was really, at that time, solidarity with Korea meant North Korea,
Yes.
right? Solidarity with Korea meant, and so the presentation, the figure of Kim Il-sung played a role even in the various communist countries. In Korea, it must have been overwhelmingly strong. I mean, one of the ways of looking at that is looking at art. You go around and look at sculpture, statues. I don't want to make any kind of judgment of how many statues of Comrade Kim Il-sung exist in North Korea. And in the plastic arts and painting and all the rest, and literature, how much of a role. So I think one really has to see a culture. And of course, time.
Yes.
Time. Because in Germany, the war is over in 1945.
Yeah.
It's foreign occupations for everybody for a little while. So from 1950 to 1991, 1989 really, it's 38 years, 39 years. So in Korea, from basically 1945, because communist power in part of Korea is established then, we're talking about now almost 80 years, much longer time.
And also,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, and also I think the communication is still between the two Germanys was even then much more.
It's more isolated.
Yes.
I mean, in the German case,
It was,
family reunification, travel.
yeah.
A West German person could travel to
Yes, exactly.
to East Germany and to actually visit relatives and family. I don't know. You might know something about this, whether that's possible in the Korean context
Is it?
to actually visit North Korea to see.
No, it's not.
It's not.
It is not.
So that's what he's saying.
It is.
much more opposed to China.
Well, no, I understand. I understand that
So maybe they're.
inevitably you- But
But
but I find this kind of interesting, and you guys could comment on this. I mean, you know, China, which is so big and so difficult, obviously, to govern, is a much freer society than North Korea,
Yeah.
right? Economically, clearly, since Deng Xiaoping, China has gone through a dramatic restructuring of the economy, creating, and I think you have to give credit, lifting more people out of poverty than anybody else in history. So they achieved a lot. Why don't they foster or impose or facilitate this system for North Korea too? I don't know the answer. And it's not as if they could not.
They could not.
Not as if they could not,
Well, they have.
right?
North Korea has now atomic bomb. They can.
No, it's not
They
only
can.
that. I mean,
I mean,
you look,
I don't-
you talk about a superpower.
Yes.
I mean, North Korea would have been lost had it
is
not
true.
been for what was
I don't-
called, and I don't know what you guys think of it. In Hungary, we call them Chinese volunteers.
Mm.
It was called volunteers. They were not volunteers; they were the People's Army units, very large ones that were included in the fight. I mean, the only reason why North Korea survived at all is because of the intervention of China.
Mhm.
And so, in that sense, it's a puzzle for me why they don't push for more. Probably they think, if I can think with the head of the Chinese leadership, which is very presumptuous, but I'll do it anyway. If I can think with them, they think, where will it stop? If we promote a market restructuring of North Korea, why won't it go in the direction of Taiwan or Singapore or or South Korea, right? In that sense, if you of course the obvious place is South Korea. If you allow something to change like that, unification will occur and it will become part of South Korea. So in a way, keeping them or allowing them to remain a kind of sultanistic, isolated version of a communist state, you are defending them against total transformation. And I think that this must be the reason. Because China could change it if it wished, could introduce the Chinese model or force it to introduce the Chinese model. They don't. Why don't they? Because I think they think that it will be then impossible to stop. It will just move in the direction of unification. That will be that. But I think I would say that's the reason. But it's a puzzle because when you have such a dynamic economy as China, and I mean, I don't know what the level of hunger in North Korea, but I'm sure that there is deprivation.
Yes.
Right? And so why not? But we don't know, of course, that this could change with time. Yes.
Something I wanted to ask.
Yes, please, there's something different, right? We're going around the globe, but
The relationship you mentioned between capitalism and democracy. So Marshall, I guess, and he explains how democracy actually permits, even though it fights for equality, permits equality because of the freedom of property, freedom of speech,
Yeah.
etc. So, especially in Latin America, where there's a lot of inequality that it's tied to race and it's tied to the economy, even though it's not conceptual, there's an empirical relationship between capitalism and democracy. So a lot of revolutions or protests, even though they're sort of aimed at capitalism, tend to pull back democracy.
no, this is of course our course. I mean, I'm so happy that you're asking me because I omitted an aspect of this as I was going. That is, following my son, I pushed for property and property's affinity for dictatorship. And what you're telling me, but it's the other way too, right? That is, I pushed too much in that one direction. And of course, it's not a cycle if it's only one direction anyway. We would have dictatorship everywhere because of capitalism. Marx never said that, by the way, so, the 18 Brumaire or the Civil Wars don't say that this is going to be every capitalist country. It never even says Britain will go that way, which was the central matter, So in some sense, Marx thought it was only under exceptional circumstances, and France is very exceptional because it is the country of revolutions.
Yeah.
So in France, capitalism is endangered by democracy. This, I think, was Marx's view, but it may not be in England. And now what Alexandra is saying, the missing part of my presentation, is the reverse. Now, what about dictatorship? Is dictatorship ideal for capitalism?
Sometimes.
You're giving the 100% right answer. Because with Chile, with Pinochet, you could say that, and in some settings. But the classical Marxist perspective of the Communist Manifesto and other writings is about the bourgeois revolutions.
Yeah.
The bourgeois revolutions. And why does capitalism want democracy according to that argument? Well, because the active part of the bourgeois economic transformation is excluded from politics in lots of European states, and they want in. And democracy is a method of getting in. So that would be the simplest argument, is that historically the bourgeoisie is democratic because it's excluded. It wants to participate. And in the French Revolution, you can certainly see that kind of logic. But that is not the best argument. The best Marxist argument would come from what Marx describes as the relationship of capital to capital, or the plurality of capitalisms. In other words, capitalist interests are in a competitive relationship with one another. So, of course, they need a state as the referee. But they also need to know that one factor, one sector doesn't dominate over the rest. So you need a certain kind of state in which different sectors of society can make inputs. And of course, that means big capital and small capital. It means agricultural and industrial. It means commercial, and they all have different interests. So the best Marxist answer would say that in order to bring all these interests into the political frame and reconcile their conflicts, liberal democracy is the best solution. Marx says someplace, Bonapartism is a religion of the bourgeoisie. But you could just as well say liberal capitalism is a religion of the bourgeoisie. Under, as you said, sometimes one, sometimes the other. Now, when does bourgeoisie switch religions from liberal democracy to Bonapartism? When it's endangered. The Marxian argument is not focused on ideology, because ideologically, the bourgeoisie is liberal democratic. That's what they kind of prefer. Most of their intellectuals prefer that. Most of their great sources prefer it. Whether Ricardo or Adam Smith or Jean-Baptiste Say, the great economists are all constitutionalists also. So the religion, that's the religion. But what if, and that's the Bonapartism argument of Marx, what if democracy, especially in the country of revolutions, comes to the point where it demands that property rights be limited, that the state do more for the victims and the poor, and all the rest of these things. Then you can switch religions. Religion is not the important thing. It's property that is the important thing from this classical point of view. But what if you had a dictatorship for a long time? As Marx says, and he already has this argument, it's not so pleasant for many middle-class people, because their sons and daughters are carted off to jail too. A dictatorship is unpredictable. A dictatorship is arbitrary. It can also enter into property system by picking winners and losers. So from that point of view, the bourgeoisie cycles between two religions, fitting into the course, right? And you can see that. Now, I totally follow my son in this argument, because to me, the cycle cannot be explained on this basis alone. It would be too economic deterministic, It's not always under these conditions that dictatorships are emerge, and it's not only under conditions of certain kinds of dictatorships that are particularly repressive, that there is a kind of middle class or liberal drive to restore democracy. So I think that the argument is too pat or too simplistic, and it leads to the idea that as long as you have capitalism, I don't have to even give the course, right? Because as long as you have capitalism, you're going to have this cycle. That's what this would lead to. It's the problem is not the cycle. The problem is capitalism. As long as you have it, you're going to have this cycle. Now, I don't want to buy this argument. First of all, the historical, we talked about time, right? The historical periods in which there is no cycle, doesn't seem to be a cycle, are quite different. I mean, there are places with no cycle at all, like let's say the United Kingdom, which, yes, there is the Irish question, and there are some authoritarian aspects. Colonialism, of course, created an interest in certain kinds of dictatorships in certain parts of the globe. But still, with respect to continental UK, there has been no cycle. And of course, there are places like France. People count up how many constitutions France has had since the revolution, 13 or 14. And some of them were Napoleonic, so one kind of dictatorship, two, right? Under Vichy, there's a third, like that. And then there are radical democratic dictatorships like that of the Jacobins. So France, there's a lot of cycle. And so capitalism, if it explained everything, wouldn't be able to tell you that, or why some countries have such long ones. And look, I mean, when is, you'll know the exact date, when is the democratic transition occur in Korea? 1960s sometimes, right? Or when the Park regime falls.
Park regime falls 79.
Okay.
Another soldier.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but still, you have had a relatively long period of constitutionalism, right? And if you go next door to Japan, well, they certainly had a dictatorship during the Second World War. So the classical imperial system was converted into a fascist type dictatorship. But since 1945, there's no cycle in Japan. That's almost 80 years. So I think that the capitalist explanation. Now, if you're a social democrat like I tend to be, right, you will say that the cycle is diminished in those places where there's social reform. So let's say the UK, well, labor governments, welfare state, national health system. Mrs. Thatcher has weakened these things, but has not abolished them. So if you really have a social intervention, you mentioned Marshall, right? Well, that's his argument, basically, is that social rights are the thing that stabilizes in the context of capitalist contest, because the other rights would produce tremendous inequality and hardship. So the third right, the third set of rights, social rights, well, that was the ideology of the British welfare state that he was presenting in intellectual terms. And now if you say, what about Japan, which after all has not been a social democracy, but there's a real paternalistic welfare state aspect of the Japanese state too. So you could say is that contrary to what the neoliberals now say since the 1980s, state interventionism stabilizes capitalism. That's Mr. Keynes, right? That's Keynesian economics. Anyhow, though, Alexander, it's very good that you brought in that side, because with this property argument, you go too far in the direction of property and dictatorship, where of course there's also a story of property and constitutionalism, and you can see why constitutionalism is everything being equal. Constitutionalism is the best system for property, because if there are constitutional rules, then property becomes also something that receives protection. Now, of course, the welfare state then modifies that. Oh, yeah, we have a little more time. Anybody else? Now, these are good comments from the class. Just we want to get more of you to get involved. Okay, please.
Yeah, half of this Japan case.
Yeah.
Just from my point of view, they are a capitalist country, but they have a kind of culture where people are not really capitalized because they always save, they are diligent, but they do not like go shopping or buy. It's kind of related to desire, I think. So you said that you mentioned that capitalism has a cycle, but like it seems like Japanese people are not on the board of the cycle.
So here's a problem that I immediately think of as you're speaking. These comments from the class are really good today. Marx talks about cycles.
Yes.
Not the cycle of discourse, the business cycle, boom and bust, right? And to some extent, your remarks are addressing why that could be, as Keynes would say, flattened out. Keynes didn't think that his theory of interventionism abolishes the economic cycle, but it flattens it out. In other words, the ups are not such big ups, because when the up is, then we redistribute more and we make sure that we take care of social needs that have been neglected. And as a result, the downs are not so low either. So there's a business cycle that Keynes, there are better departments or better people in the new school who can teach you this, but still, obviously, this is when Marx and Keynes come together, right? The business cycle, Marx's idea was very radical. I mean, you have really not just crises, but really, depressions, which are going to really shake the whole social system. And Keynes thought, well, we're going to have a cycle, but not quite as radical. Now, the puzzle that you make me raise in my own head, what's the relationship of this cycle to the other cycle? And my instinct is to say, is no strict relationship. That is, dictatorships doesn't come in the down part of the cycle, and democracy doesn't necessarily come in the up part of the cycle. We would have thought, for example, that in the case of the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes of Latin America, the economic picture would be similar as they develop, but it's not. In a weird way, the Chilean development, well, perhaps you could say that certain kinds of economic policy are more successful even under conditions of dictatorship, but did manage to reduce the dependence and indebtedness of the Chilean economy, which is certainly not the case. I mean, I'm so happy about how this Argentine election is now turning out, but I'm sure you're not even sure yet. Not even sure yet. You gave us a scare with this guy, but I mean, his answer was I mean, you could say that in his case, the two cycles would have come together, because he would have radically. I mean, to dollarize the Argentine economy would represent a tremendous shock to all those who have small savings. They would all be gone. So the level of poverty that his policy would produce would have been radical. And on the other side, you could have only sustained that through authoritarian means. So the danger, as I read it in Argentina, was the two kinds of cycles coming together. A down of the business cycle, which to some extent Argentina is right now already having difficulties, but this would have radicalized them. And then, of course, political authoritarianism. But I would say that in general, that equation doesn't hold. Now, could you say that the Marxian business cycle is part of the logic of this somehow in some indirect way? Well, that perhaps is right. But what you say about Japan is above all relevant to the economic cycle. That the Japanese nature of the Japanese cultural attitudes which you describe would create would ameliorate even without Keynes. And I'm sure the Japanese state also is Keynesian and intervenes in the economy in all kinds of ways. But even before then, the social customs and habits and ethos, I don't know if it's a Confucian heritage in Japan or not, or which part of Japanese culture it comes from that you describe, but it certainly ameliorates the economic business cycle. But Japan, since the Second World War, has no authoritarian experiment. Now, you could say that's because it's kind of authoritarian as a version of democracy anyway. I don't know if that's your view, but in any case, I can't think of any constitutional democracy. Japan has a well-developed constitution and so on. I can't think of any other where there's so little alteration in power of political parties. Yeah. I mean, there's only one episode, right? And even that produces a coalition. So Japan has almost no alteration in power, which generally in the textbooks we consider, I mean, Adam Przeworski, democracy is uncertainty, right? Uncertainty in a sense that we never know from one election to another who's going to win. But in Japan, everybody always knew. Yes. Right? So in that sense, it is an unusual constitutional democracy. And one could say, to some extent, the cultural attitudes that you describe contribute to that. But certainly, it has not been going through a cycle of democracy and authoritarianism in the post-war period. And so in that sense, it is now, is relative national homogeneity play a role in this? I already said that I'm aware that Japan is not as homogeneous as the ideology would have it, but still compared to lots of other countries, lots of other places, it is. So that would be an interesting thing to really, but I think I'm not going to make you do it now. But the really interesting question, you know, obviously we don't ask this question about China because it has been a one-party rule since 1948. But about Korea, one can ask, right? Is that the Korean War, supposedly from a Western point of view, from an American point of view, was to defend democracy against communism. I mean, this is the way the thing is presented here. Back where I was, it's presented just the opposite way. A social revolution being stopped by the bad Americans and their intervention. But the fact is that after the American or after the peace, because it's not a victory of either side, the Panmunjom agreements lead to a ceasefire and the end of the war, and the two Koreas remain. Why is the development toward the dictatorship after the peace? Is it the heritage of the war? Or is it a heritage of something else? And then why the shift? That would be something for you to, I don't want to make you do it because, you know, this is not the obligation of everybody here to work on their own national context, even though we generally know it best, right, compared to everything else. But for me, it's a very interesting problem. Very interesting problem of why dictatorship at all. I mean, it's not as if there's going to be a North Korean invasion any moment and the democracy is going to be endangered. American troops are there anyway. Are they still there, by the way? Yeah. Yes. They're still there, right? So this is from 1951 or 2 to the present. There is a kind of occupation like in Germany to some extent, right? In Germany, they're not really an important factor now. So there's no real threat. It's not a authoritarianism because external threat, right? So why? And it's an interesting puzzle for this class of why the United States engaged in democracy promotion, supposedly, and why does it put up with South Korean authoritarianism? You say until 79, you said, right? That's a long time. Korean War ends in 53 or 52, and you have 27 years of, I mean, I don't want to describe the authoritarianism. I'm not an expert. I can't say how authoritarian it is, but are there elections between 53 and 79?
Yeah.
You have elections. Are parties permitted to compete
No.
relatively freely?
Oh, yeah.
Well, obviously not the Communist Party.
No,
Oh.
That's banned. Banned.
Sorry.
I'm talking about the South. North Korea has elections too, but we don't need to talk about that. But the elections of the South, are they truly contested or
Yes.
they are? So how does the one authoritarian leadership remain in power? Because they win.
Yeah, because
They win. Anyway, these are every country, every setting is a puzzle on its own. And so, when I say I don't know, it's because I don't know most of the countries that you guys are from. But I think it would be an interesting project of why. And then once it's gone, why doesn't it come back? Why does the dictatorship not come back? Right? That's another. So you have a cycle, but it's a very short period for each version. Why not return to the previous? I mean, these are speculative questions because the future is always speculative. Thank you very much. I must say that the questions in the class are especially good because they make me return to things that I omitted and didn't do well. And I think, for example, Alexander's question about, I did an overly one-sided view of property and dictatorship under my son's influence, probably. And in fact, the causal chain also goes the other way. And I think Marx knew that there was, and I think Marx actually, if you really, a history